Why We Bleep is sponsored by Signal Sounds. In my quite alarmingly insane drive to possess cheap analog synths, I've taken a time machine back 35 years to 1989, and I'm currently standing in a red telephone box, systematically combing the classifieds in the back of Sound on Sound, trying to find an Oberheim OBX for 150 quid. But everyone I call says confusedly they've already spoken to me, and I just went down to collect it. Damn it! It's alternate me from another timeline, getting there first every time! Can't me catch a break? Oh well, I guess I'll have to head back to the future and hit up signalsounds.com. You can buy a box fresh OBX8, brand spanking new, with a warranty and Tom Oberheim's loving kiss for about £4,799. That's only about £1.50, adjusted for inflation. So if you struggle with mathematics, visit signalsounds.com. That's signalsounds.com. Why We Bleep is also sponsored by thonk.co.uk. This month, Steve from Thonk wanted me to tell you about Plinky. Don't you know about Plinky? It's the melancholic, fragile polysynth and granular sampler, which is a Euro-rackable tiny little square, and you press your fingers onto the quivering surface, and such beautiful gorgeosity springs forth. You can buy Plinkies now. You can build Plinkies now. The COVID drama is beaten. The 8,000-person queue is vanquished. Alex Evans, who made it, is a super brainy inventor who worked at Media Molecule, making Little Big Planet, and so much more. I spoke to him the other day, actually, and he is a G. Yes, he's a lovely person, and you should consider purchasing and building a Plinky. You get beautiful melancholic sounds, you can touch and prod and enjoy it. So check out Plinky at Thonk. That's thonk.co.uk. Why? Welcome to Why We Bleep, and I don't know if you've been keeping score, but I have, and from where I'm sitting, I am fairly sure that we have put out 50 episodes. And although 50 is just a number and probably the new 40, I thought it would be nice to do something a bit special to mark the occasion. And if I asked you to take a piece of paper out and write down a name of the most legendary synth brands of the 20th century, I think it's a reasonable certainty that your list would have the following words in it. And they are Moog, Roland, Korg, Yamaha, ARP, Sequential, and Oberheim. Oberheim is one of the big three American legendary synth brands, and Oberheim's, the synthesizer, can be heard on a great many records from the 70s into the 80s to now. From Stevie Wonder to Prince to Van Halen, of course, the 20th century and 21st century's music is littered with Oberheims. And Tom Oberheim, who we meet today, is the man behind Oberheim, as you might imagine, and has many innovations up his sleeve, such as Tom created, to our knowledge, the first phase shifter, and also the first commercially available polysynth, a thing called a 4-voice. And his story, his life story, is a brilliant example of how you never know where you're going to end up, because Tom did not start his life thinking that he was going to become a legendary synth brand. At the time of recording this conversation, which was in September 2024, Tom was 88 years old. But like Rose in 1997's biggest film, Tom can still smell the fresh paint. It's a zigzag story, but a fascinating one. I am extremely honoured to be able to talk to Tom. How cool is that? So, without further ado, Let's talk to Tom Oberheim, shall we? Thanks. You mentioned to me that you're not sort of designing, but are you retired, or are you still doing stuff for Oberheim?
Okay. Some people, when they retire, they quit their job and they move to the beach, or, of course, I don't know if you have any beach in the UK.
We have beach, Tom, but it's only good about 3 days of the year.
And then if you go to Scotland, it's even worse, right? Now, where are you located?
I'm in Leeds, so I'm kind of smack in the middle and quite away from the beach. But, I've been to Scotland, and ironically, some of the beaches, they look like, Maui or sort of, Australia, but it's like about 2 degrees C, So, but you're in California, right? And you don't have that problem.
When I was younger and for a good part, before I was married, I lived in Santa Monica, and I wasn't a beach person, but it was nice that it was there.
Yeah.
It's just the weather, you get the ocean breeze, but where I live now is about 15 minutes east of Berkeley, California.
For the uninitiated, is that sort of, are you like Silicon Valley? Is it that sort of technology hub, or what would you say is the culture where you live?
First of all, the boundaries of Silicon Valley are very fuzzy. The semiconductor companies and computer companies that brought out the term Silicon Valley are anywhere from 20 to 50 miles south of downtown San Francisco. Over the years, it moved a little bit north and quite a bit south. I'm 15 minutes from UC Berkeley, which is a hotbed of technology. It's probably had more to do with high tech than any other public university. It's a state university, so it's considered public. And whereas the great tech schools of the U.S. and include MIT, Caltech, and several others are for the most part all private schools, meaning you have to pay a lot more. That's all it means. I worked at UC Berkeley for 2 years in the early 2000s, and an awful lot of what goes on in the world was developed at UC Berkeley. They have a world-famous electrical engineering and computer science department. So there's a lot of tech there, but it's not. There's not as many companies as you get south of San Francisco.
It's a big question, but basically, where you grew up and the education that you'd had as a young man, like what predisposed you to take the route that you did into electronics, and who inspired you to do so?
The only common thread is that I started playing around with electronics, which I guess when I was probably 9 or 10, with a crystal set, and then later I started building stuff with tubes a little bit as a hobby. But even by the time I was through what we call grade school, which is the first half of the 12 years that we go to school before university, I knew I wanted to be an electrical engineer.
Wow. But how? Why that and not anything else, do you think?
Well, when I was growing up, there was one magazine available to me in the United States that had news of new things, and I read it cover to cover. In those days, we had access to a company called the Heathkit Company, where you could buy kits for voltmeters and even oscilloscopes and stuff. And then we had a couple of mail order companies where you could get resistors, tubes, pots, and all of that stuff. And it was just fun to play around with. And the other thing that was really important is the town in which I was born is in the state of Kansas, is right in the middle of the U.S. and as the town where Kansas State University is. And they had a very good electrical engineering department. And every year they had an open house. And I went to that with bated breath every year from 7th grade on. I just knew I'd be an electrical engineer. That's all I wanted to do. And I actually went to the first 3 years of university work at Kansas State University. Where I lived was a quarter mile from the campus. I could just walk to class. And, I did all the standard stuff of first year physics and chemistry and 3 semesters of calculus and on and on and on. And it never occurred to me to do anything. I wasn't involved in music really at all. But I was in a fraternity. I didn't have the money to live in the fraternity, but it was right in town. So I left at home. And so a number of my fraternity brothers, they would, after classes, they would go to this little coffee shop place and they'd play bridge in the afternoon, whereas I had to go to work.
So that's not ideal.
A camera shop. And so I decided to take a semester and summer off and go to the largest town in Kansas at the time, which is a city called Wichita, where there were a lot of airplane factories. And I went there to make some money so I could go back to Kansas State and go back to school. And I didn't have to go work. I could go to
hang out
and play bridge. And of course, I had no idea how to play bridge, but that didn't matter. So I got to Wichita. I got a job. I made some money. And a grad student in art that I'd met at Kansas State had moved to Wichita to get his art degree, and he let me stay with him while I found a place to live. And so I did that for a couple months. And one day, one of his buddies, artist student, there was 4 or 5 of them. They're all artist students, and it was great because they stayed up all night and listened to jazz. And I don't remember then. Smoking marijuana, I don't think it was
not in that house, at least.
It wasn't available in Kansas in those days.
It's not in Kansas anymore.
One day said, "Tom, a couple of us are going to move to California. You want to come with us?" And I thought about that for about 20 seconds and said, "Sure," with no idea of how I'd support myself. I just said, "Sure." So one of them backed out, but the other one, one of the other did actually team up with me, and we drove my little broken down car all the way to Los Angeles. I got there, and I was just in heaven. I did get a job the first day I was there in an aircraft company working in their photo lab, because I'd had a job in Manhattan at a camera shop. It just turned out that the photo lab, in addition to doing pictures of different stuff that they were building in that factory, they used the photo lab to make these new things called printed circuit boards. And I'd never seen that in my life. We're talking 1956.
Yeah. So
I learned what a printed circuit board was. It was kind of interesting, but I didn't like working there because it was
dark,
an aircraft company.
I imagine as well.
Very nice. And so in December of 1956, I saw an ad in the Los Angeles Times jobs section for a draftsman trainee at a company in the Los Angeles area. And I'd had a semester of drafting at Kansas State, so I applied for the job and got the job. And this company turned out to be one of the very early computer companies in the United States. It's like the fourth or fifth computer company in the United States. It's part of a very large company, very old company called National Cash Register, which was a big company, but this was their electronics division, and they were building computers. And they just started out, the division had been there like a year or so. Computers were brand new. I certainly didn't know what a computer was, but once I got there and I saw from the inside, saw what it was about, I was just in love. I knew that that's what I had to do. And so I worked there for a little bit, and then being around the engineers there that were designing these computers, I said, I've got to go back to school. Because I kind of figured, okay, I'm done with college. I'm footloose, fancy free in Los Angeles. I never have to go back to school. I got there and I said, I got to go back. So
had you not finished college by that point? You were just kind of taking a bit of time out.
Yeah, I'd gone to Wichita to make some money so I could go back and complete my thing.
Yeah.
Instead, I just totally changed my life direction. But I had to go back and get my degree. So it turned out that UCLA was nearby, only about 10 minutes away. My classes at Kansas State transferred to UCLA, and I started working at UCLA and stayed working as a draftsman at this computer company, but started taking classes. I actually changed my major from electrical engineering to physics because I learned from the engineers I met at the computer company that you could get an electrical engineering job with a physics degree as well as an engineering degree. And I only needed 120 units to graduate in physics, where I would have to have 144 units to graduate in engineering. So I changed to physics. Once I changed to physics, I had to move to a different college. This is the case where it's still the university, but they had different major sections they called colleges. Engineering was a college. In physics, I was in the Department of art or letters and science. I forget. Anyway, I got into physics, and one of the side courses I had to take was a year in art and a year in music. I knew nothing about music. I never played an instrument and nothing. So I got in this class. It was called Music Appreciation, and this was not for the music major. This was for the general university sorority girls and football players type of thing. And I got totally transformed. I completely became interested in music. I still wanted to get the degree, so that got me going in music.
What was it, Tom? Like, what can you put your finger on what it was that excited you so much?
I did listen to music a bit, but it was always jazz, and I didn't know much about how music was made or anything. And this class was a standard, Baroque music, Baroque period, classic period, Romantic period, Impressionist period, 20th century. And I just found it super fascinating.
It sounds like you had a good teacher, and that maybe made all the difference.
He was great. I couldn't take a full load of studies every semester because I had to work and support myself completely. I had, no family money, nothing. It was just me by myself in California. Some semesters I took one physics class, some semesters two. And so instead of taking 4 years, it took me 6 or 7 years. But I always had jobs that allowed me to work a little bit, go to class. For 5 of those years, I had a Lambretta motor scooter, then I could go to class and park my motor scooter right next to either the physics building or the music building, and then I could run off to work and work a while, and then I could go back and take more classes. So I did that for 5 or 6 years. I finally did get a degree. It just took me a long time. And during those 5 or 6 years, I did start singing in the UCLA choir and found out that I had a pretty good ear, which I didn't know. And I didn't work full time, but working to support myself and taking 1 or 2 classes a semester. I started singing in this UCLA choir, and then I started singing, also singing in a church choir, and then a local choir. I just started doing this crazy singing. I had rehearsals 4 nights a week, and so I'd end up starting 11 at night to study, and I never studied very much. I got horrible grades, but I loved it. And so that led me up to the end of the university. And at the university, the people I met were music majors. I took a lot more music classes after this introductory class, and I had a lot of my friends were music majors, and in this 1965-66 time frame, we all graduated. One of these people that was in a group of musicians that had a band at UCLA, experimental music, and one of the members of this band asked me to build them a ring modulator. And I said, I don't know, what's a ring modulator? I have no idea. So I went to the UCLA Engineering Library and took out books and found out that, well, here's a circuit for ring modulator. And I'd open this book and I'd look at the circuit. I had no idea how it could be
what
used.
It was, or how to make it. Would you?
Yeah, it was 4 diodes in a ring and a couple transformers, and I had absolutely no idea how to use that in music. So I kept looking and found an electronic magazine that was oriented toward engineering, not like hobbyists or makers, but professional engineers. And I found this article that was written by Harold Boda, which was a cohort of Robert Moog later, and he had built this system of sound modification in 1959 or so. And it was different circuits. It wasn't a synthesizer at all. It didn't make music, but it modified sound. And one of the circuits in there was a ring modulator. And I could see, you have a carrier, an oscillator goes in one, you put music sound in the other, you get these sum and difference frequencies, and etc. So I built a prototype, and it kind of worked. And I built another one, and then I built another one.
Where were you building that?
I had a 1-room apartment in Santa Monica, and I converted this closet into a tiny little lab. I was still single, so it was just me, and by then I collected some gear. I had a little oscilloscope and soldering iron, and I'd experimented with other stuff. I really didn't learn anything at UCLA about electronics, but I was learning it on my own. And so I'd built up 2 or 3 ring modulators, and I thought, well, I don't see how they don't seem very musical because they're pretty crazy, but
Yeah, it just goes like, wow.
That's right. But one day I got a phone call from this movie composer, Leonard Rosenman, who was one of the big-time composers at the time in the Hollywood movie scene. And Leonard said, I'm doing a movie, and I'd like to use the sound of the ring modulator on it. This movie was called Beneath the Planet of the Apes. And I said, okay. So I gathered up my ring modulator and a couple speakers and an amp and a microphone, and I took them all to 20th Century Fox and came up to the guard shack and figured that they'd probably say, "Get out of here." And I told the guard what my name was. He said, "Oh yeah, you go down to building 12." And I got there and I set it all up, big, good-sized symphony orchestra, and he did some takes.
With what? Like, what did he put through it?
Piano.
Right.
Oh, yeah, it's a grand piano.
So had you created a carrier oscillator as well? Were you operating that?
By then, the ring modulator I built had a microphone preamp. It had a sine wave oscillator that could be buried over a large range. And then the key to making it a ring modulator is the two resistors that sum together the original sound with the ring modulated sound. You put in two frequencies, it develops sum and difference frequencies and suppresses the original carrier and the incoming signal. It was just one box then went to an amp and a couple speakers and had a microphone input. During the break, when the musicians on this movie thing took a break, several of them, three or four of them came over and said, "Tom, can I buy one?" I said, "Sure." So, to make a long story short, I went into business selling ring modulators.
How did he get your number, Tom? Like, it's just quite a call as well for a young man to be like, how did he literally get your number and figuratively?
Well, I knew some. I've gotten to know several musicians through UCLA, and then met other musicians. And I don't know. I think he just called one day.
Found you? Yeah, he found you out.
And
when that ring modulator was not the one, because there's this. I've seen the image of like the beautiful kind of New York taxi cab colored box with the thumbs up, the amazing logo. Was it that at that point, or was it just kind of a silver box?
Well, the first ones were just plain aluminum boxes, like the one I took to the movie thing. But
by the way, as well, before we get past this, what did it sound like in the room? Like, do you remember when you were hearing your device being played professionally? What was that like?
Well, I played around with it a bit. I knew what it was going to sound like, but the movie set situation being where they'd do a short take and then they'd stop and the composer would change things. It was like 20 seconds of music that took 3 hours or something. But what was more important to me is at the break, when these 3 or 4 of the musicians in the orchestra came up and wanted to buy one, that was really, and then the word got around and I started getting more people. So I actually sat down and designed a nice box, and I met this young woman who had a 3-person ad agency, and I asked her to get me some letterhead and business cards, and also maybe showed her the box, and maybe they could come up with some idea. The advertising agent that she had chosen came back with this design and what is still the Oberheim logo, and with silk screening with black and white and yellow paint. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. And that's the way it happened.
That is amazing, because it is like, I think to this day, Tom, I think you have officially the coolest logo in all of. I mean, don't tell folks that Logo said that, but I think it's it's just such a fun. It's fun and playful and kind of,
it's just a great.
Yeah. I got a bunch of those when I went to Super Booth, and I went to the Oberheim stand and they had those. I was just like, I filled my pockets, Tom. I hope you don't mind, because it's cool. And so you have a beautiful looking box, and I
make it one at a time. Of course, to build the aluminum box, I had to build I did find a company that make me 25 boxes or something.
I was going to say, you can't really machine that in your one bed flat, can you?
Then one day I got this phone call from a guy who was the marketing manager at this large Chicago musical instrument company, and they had a product line called Maestro, and they didn't build anything. They built big things. They build Gibson guitars and I forget which organ, the largest electronic organ company in the U.S. at the time. But they had this little division, and 3 or 4 companies were working. Were building Maestro phase tone and the pedal or two, and they said we'd like to put the ring modulator in the line, and so I did that. And meanwhile, I'm still in my little one-room apartment in Santa Monica with my little converted closet.
And you're like, we must be early 20s, or how old are you at this point?
That was around 69, so I was 33 years old.
Oh, yeah, of course. Well,
started late.
Yeah, and it took a while to get to university.
I got to be good friends with a guy in LA who had been the first person to bring a Moog synthesizer to Los Angeles. And he was a very interesting guy. He was a collector of electronic music instruments. He had all kinds of stuff, German stuff and Italian stuff, and some early electronic music done by some people in the U.S. And in fact, that was visiting his place one time. It's the first time I saw a synthesizer.
Yeah.
And
what was the first synth? Would that be a Moog that you saw? Or
it was a Moog. It was the early Moog. And this was like I say, 1969, 1970.
That would be a modular, surely, because there was
1971. There was no mini Moog yet. I had heard on records this interesting sound that later became what was called flanging. And I thought, well, I wonder if there's a way to make that sound in a pedal. And I asked him, well, what do you do to make this flanging sound? He said, and I said, well, you hook up 2 tape recorders, you mix them together, and you kind of slow down one of the motor in one of them, and you get these really nice cancellations. And if you speed them up or slow them down more and more, these cancellations go through the frequency range. And I said, oh. So I thought, okay, how would I do that? And this is long before DSP. I had no DSP experience. I had no really solid university experience in sound because I flunked the sound class.
Oh dear.
It was so boring. And then I came across there was a company in Los Angeles building op amps, and the first op amps that you could buy, just an op amp for audio, little tiny one-man company. And he put out a one-sheet of circuits that defined how to do an inverting amp, a non-inverting, all with his op amp, a non-inverting, inverting. This is before you could buy a semiconductor op amp. It was before that. They'd come out, but they weren't in the mainstream yet. And you could do filters and all kinds of things with this thing called op amps. And they had circuits on there. And one circuit was a phase shift circuit. I didn't know what that meant, so I had to look it up in a book that phase shift is changing the phase but not changing the frequency response. I don't know what got into my head, because I certainly wasn't very even though I had my degree by then, I was really not very technical, not in the deep sense like somebody that was a PhD or something. But I called my friend who had this collection of instruments, and I talked about this flanging thing. And the crucial thing that he told me is you take the original sound of one tape recorder and the original sound out of the second one. When you mix them together, there's cancellations. And somehow I thought, I don't know, I didn't analyze it, like it just occurred to me what I'd try building a couple of these phase shift circuits and then put an instrument into it and mix the original, and sure enough, it didn't make the flanging sound, but it made a nice sound. So then I since I already had a way of making this ring modulator box, I used the same exact box and built up a phase shifter and showed it this guy that was at the Chicago company buying different effects, and I showed it to him. He said, "Well, yeah, it makes an interesting sound, and we might be able to sell a few." So I started making phase shifters for it's called the Maestro phase shifter, and by then I had a little. Actually, by then I was out of my apartment. I had a little storefront. That I and a woman that was building the circuit boards for the ring modulator, and she had a helper. There's the three of us, and so I put production type unit together for the Chicago company, and they started selling them. And over the next 2 or 3 years, I sold 70,000 Maestro phase shifters.
70,000.
That really put me on the map.
And I bet now, if those little bad boys turn up on Reverb, they're worth a pretty penny, I'm sure.
Oh yeah.
I hope you kept a few.
I've got one.
Okay. Treasure of that. I mean, and that was one of the first phases, Tom. Just to.
Well, the only one that I knew about at the time that's even close to that was the Univibe. And when I heard, I asked my friend. He had the guys had all this equipment, the Moog and all this other stuff. He had a Univibe. He and I put an instrument through it, and it certainly had a vibrato sound, but it didn't sound like it didn't come anywhere like flanging. And the stuff I done was it wasn't like flanging. It wasn't as good as flanging, but it was more than that. And the only thing I can figure out is that the Japanese guy who invented the Univibe and became very well known in electronic music circles, I think what happened is that he didn't sum the output with the input to get these marvelous cancellations. That's all I can think. I don't know because I've never met him. I've seen an old Univibe that didn't seem to sum the two signals together, and I've seen a more recent Univibe that does sum the two together. But other than that, the only ones out there were mine in terms of actual phase shifting. A year and a half later, there's phase 90, and then they went crazy from there. But my friend who helped me with the what is a flanger, I went to his place a lot because it's fun to look at all the stuff he had. German and French and
are these all synths, Tom, or is it sort of like synths and like kind of like broadcast equipment and whacking oscillators and stuff? Or what were you like drawn to and playing with there?
You mean what was he had in his place?
Yeah, what was it? Particularly, what was inspiring you is what I'm wondering. What were you gravitating to?
That's what I was getting at. When I got there, I said I asked him more about the Moog. He showed me the basics, oscillators, filters a little bit, and then he played this famous sound that using just his Moog, where it's this sound that starts and goes that you see now in movies. And he later put that on an LP, and I've got that. It's a very famous sound. In fact, it was later part of the advertising advertising that. Oh boy, I can't think of the name of the company that would play this sound in a movie, but
like THX, like this.
Yeah,
yeah, like the sort of descending oscillators.
That was too clean.
Yeah,
the thing he showed me was an analog synth, so it wasn't perfect, and so I got interested in what a synthesizer was, and now because I was making the Maestro ring modulator, the Maestro phase shifter, and by then I was making another pedal where it was you'd play the guitar and trigger it, and it would open and close a filter, Mutron.
Right.
It's kind of like that. And so I started going to NAMM shows, and in 1971, I wasn't exhibiting yet because I was selling everything I made through this company in Chicago. And I went by the art booth, and I had this idea of how I could supplement my income. I said, could I be your dealer in Los Angeles? And they said, well, no, we want to, we want to set up Guitar Center and whatever. And because I said, okay. So, but then I didn't happen. They didn't set up anybody. Nobody in LA was selling, or as far as I know, anywhere in the Western U.S., nobody was selling ARP. So finally I talked them into it, and I became an ARP dealer.
Is that on sale or return? Did they not ask you to buy a bunch on, or how do you just a dude in a shop?
No, this ARP has only been out about a year or so.
Were they happy to have someone? I know that they in New York, they struggled to get them to take.
I had by then a modest Rolodex with the names of a bunch of Hollywood professional musicians that started when I went to that movie thing. So I became an art dealer, and right off the bat, I sold 6 2600s in the first couple months. And
was it? What did they have to sell? The Odyssey and the 2600 at that point?
Well, they had the 2500, but they didn't sell very many of those. They had 2600 in the Odyssey. That's all they had. Because they'd only been in business a year or two. So I sold Leon Russell his 2600, and I sold Lalo Schifrin. I sold him his 2600.
Right. Well, okay. Out of interest, what was your technique for selling? I've been a salesman as well, and I wonder how would you sell me one of these? What convinced people, I suppose, is the question.
Well, I didn't have a spiel. The word was starting to get around about this thing called synthesizers. But I had my Rolodex. I'd call them up and say I'm selling ARP and synthesizers. And I remember going to Lalo Schifrin's house in Beverly Hills and carrying in my 2600 and setting it up. And he said, I want one.
Yeah.
I remember going, in those days, Leon Russell was living in Los Angeles. I went to see him, and boy, talk about trying to deal price with me. My first experience, he ran me through the coals to get the better price. So by then I was selling ARPs, I was selling ring modulators, I was selling phase shifters. I had a nice little business, just me and two people, and the synth thing was all by myself. I'd call somebody, or they'd call me, and I'd take a machine to their house, their studio, their house, or whatever, and show them. I had some good patches to show them, and it was easy. I didn't have to sell it; it sold itself.
Yeah, totally.
It was cheap. It was $2,500, which is, of course, in today's money, $2,500 would be a lot more, but still, it wasn't super expensive.
Yeah.
As you may remember, the keyboard was in a separate box with some kind of pitch. It wasn't a wheel; it was a lever or something. I don't remember. There was a pitch knob or something on a circuit board, and I opened it up, and I noticed that there's some places for parts on this circuit board that had no parts they were unassembled, and I wondered what that was. And so I was talking to my contact at ARP, and he said, well, on the 2500, we would fill those parts, and you could from a regular synth keyboard, you could develop two CVs, two pitch CVs.
I play it duophonically.
Yeah, I figured out what the circuit was. I stuffed those. I played around and found that yes, you could develop two keyboard CVs, and so I started making a little kit that I sold. 30, 40, 50 of these kits that you get two CVs from the keyboard. You press one note and you get the same thing on both, and you press a second note, you get a second CV. It was not very crude. It didn't trigger different envelope generators, anything like that. It's very crude. And during this time, this is in early, 71 or 2, a person who I'd met in the music department at UCLA became a very close friend, who was a keyboard improviser and gave keyboard improvisation concerts around Los Angeles. I rigged up this collection of my stuff, which is a couple of ring modulators and a couple of ARP 2600s. I had this, I called it a two-voice. Of course, it wasn't a voice. I called it a two-voice kit, but it wasn't really a voice. And I figured out how to easily modify standard Revox, but it could be change the speed of the motor with a foot pedal. And I hooked all this up and had a little mixer that would mix them together. And my friend would do classic piano improvisations the first half of his concert, and then just do this kind of electronic music improvisation in this other half of the concert. And at one of those concerts, I brought two ARP 2600s that both had my kit, and so you could play 4 pitches. He was sharp enough he could play some simple box stuff, and I heard this for the first time. I'd heard a 4-voice polyphonic sound from in this case, a couple synthesizers, and I said, that sounds amazing. Totally unusable just because of his talent and these crude 2CV mod 2600, but that stuck in my head. During this time, I was selling 2600. I was selling Odysseys. I had, through my friend, I'd seen the Mini Moog, and I knew a couple of people that had Mini Moogs by then. And so because of the 10 years of digital logic experience I had in the 60s designing computers and computer-type devices, I got the idea to make a digital sequencer that used digital logic. I, of course, knew about the standard Moog, and in the case of another studio that had both a Moog and a Buchla, that potentiometer knobs type sequences were very useful, very common. But my idea was using digital logic to take the CV out of a synthesizer and convert it to digital, and then store notes as well as durations of the notes. I built this digital sequencer that not only allowed you to load the notes from the keyboard very quickly, but you could have, instead of 16, you could have, I think it was 120 notes. For a while, I sold a bunch of those. This is not long before, certainly several years before microcontrollers and microprocessors were cheap enough to use in an instrument, a musical instrument. And I sold a bunch of those.
I imagine inside your digital sequencer is absolutely stuffed with PCBs. I also know that EMS had over in the UK would have had maybe that sort of time. I have seen one once. There's like an EMS digital sequencer now as well.
I'm not sure that I never came across another sequencer that had duration stored so that you could have rhythm, but I'm sure there was some. But I was the only one doing at the time where you could call up and buy one, and they're ready to go. And there was one circuit board. I squeezed it all on one circuit board.
Okay.
It's about 50 ICs squeezed on the 50. But the problem with that product was, in those days, most people, if they had a synthesizer at all, they had one. So if you took your synthesizer and plugged in my digital sequence, DS2 it was called, you could load a sequence in very quickly, and then you could play it back through your synthesizer. But you couldn't play your synthesizer because you could play your synthesizer or the sequencer would play with it. You couldn't do both. And
I couldn't solo along with it, could you?
What if I created the absolute minimum synthesizer that's possible to make? And of course, I was wrong there. The people later did much more simple. And so what I did is sitting there with the Odyssey and to some extent, knowing the 2600, I created this thing called the SEM. And it was just the SEM with a power supply and some mini jacks. It was, of course, not programmable. That was not yet quite possible.
I have many questions. I suppose, mainly, how did you arrive at the final kind of the way the panel is laid out and the sort of bi-directional knobs and what you left out as well? Because I know how easy it is to add features, but the question is, it's taking them away. As you were saying, it's like, how simple can you be? So can you tell me, how did you develop the concept of it and the sound as well, and especially the filter particularly?
Okay, first the concept. The way I learned, when I got my 2600, I had no idea what to do with it. But it had a very nice manual written by a guy in Boston. His name was Jim Mitchmerheisen. And it very clearly explained how to use a 2600. Oscillators, filter, VCA, LFO, 2 envelope generators. To me, that's what a synthesizer was. And I looked at the Mini Moog, the same thing. It's got a couple oscillators, got a filter, VCA, 2 envelope generators, LFO. So it wasn't I that conceived what SM needed to be. It was right there in front of me because I didn't see the need for all the special circuitry that the 2600 had, like the microphone preamp and a circuit that inverted the CVs and on and on. It was just 2 oscillators. Well, it had 3 oscillators, but 2 seemed to be enough for really. Remember, this was the lowest possible synthesizer that would be any good. Never thinking I'd ever get in the synth business. I had no plans to get in the synthesizer business. It took a big company and you had to have keyboards and none of that. I just wanted something that my DS2 sequencer could play and still, have a good sound. And so it was 2 VCAs, 2 oscillators, filter, 2 envelope generators, and that, just absolute simplest synthesizer voice that I knew about. And so I started selling a few of those. And meanwhile, my business was still running modulators, phase shifters, and I had a couple other pedals. And by then I developed this monstrous thing called the USS1 synthesizer, which was a mic preamp, a phase shifter, and a bunch of stuff, a real beast. And then on January 25th, 1975, the guy that was my contact at this big Chicago company called up and said, "Times are tough. We're canceling all the orders, and we don't think we're going to buy any more."
This is for the Maestro stuff.
It was a division of Maestro. Now, there was no factory. Maestro was all these little companies. One company made fuzz tone one company did this one. As part of that scheme was the Echoplex. That was, in the same little group they had. So I had to think of what to do. And basically what I did is I remembered the time that my keyboard player friend had done this, at his concert, done this 2600 thing. And I remembered that sound. And I said, well, what if I put 4 SEMs together? There's a lot of problems because the only way to play them is through some kind of digital scanning keyboard. But I'd heard that Dave Rossum and his little company, EMU, had a scanning, polyphonic scanning keyboard. So I talked to him if I could license his design, and that started in February of '75. In June, the end of June in 1975, I was at the NAMM show with a prototype of the 4-voice. I already had the SEM, so I didn't have to design that because I designed that a year or two before. It was the first polyphonic synthesizer I think you could buy in a music store. I'm not going to get into so-and-so put a bunch of stuff together at this university or their lab here.
You could march into a shop and actually give them
the box
money.
You could buy and open up, and it was a 4-voice. It wasn't programmable, so it was a beast to change patches.
And by that, Tom, you mean, for those who are listening, it's like you literally have to change the sound on each SEM. There's no macro control.
If the sound requires it, you have to change every knob, every switch.
Of course, then there's this thing that, musically you would end up with a great variance, a subtle variance and obviously a broad variance with a multi-timbral thing. And can you speak on that? Did you hear people using that to good effect?
Well,
or did they complain about it?
Losing my orders for the pedals and having to make a synthesizer myself to survive was a change in my life. I was still very much an engineer and not a musician. It was kind of a desperation move to make it, and without any thinking of if it would even survive, if anybody'd want it. In fact, I remember at that NAMM show in June of 1975, the owner at Manny's Music came by, and because I'd sold him a bunch of phase shifters, ring modulators, and stuff. I knew him from going to his shop on 48th Street in New York. And he said, "What is it?" And I said, "Well, it's a polyphonic synthesizer." "Well, what does that mean?" I said, "That's a synthesizer you can play more than one note on. You can play chords." Said, "Oh, how much is it?" $4,000. $4,000. He says, "There's nothing in my shop that sells for $4,000. That was the days when Les Pauls were $800, right? Not what they are now. But I can't really tell you in a nice laid out historical thing. What happened is the word got out, and some important people started buying them, and some people who weren't important started buying them. So I had a nice business going by, let's say, the end of 1975 or into 1976.
Before we go any further, I still want to ask you about the SEM that was is in this thing, with particular emphasis on the filter, especially. And
okay, yeah. Well,
only because I mentioned it, Tom, because like that the filter in the SEM it's gone on to become it's a thing. It's like the Moog ladder,
We'll go back a year or so, and when I decided to make the SEM just to have something that the sequencer could play. And I didn't even have to think about what to put in it, because remember, I was thinking minimum. I wasn't going in the synth business. Just this box had no keyboard. It just would be driven by the sequencer. Because I'd sold quite a few ARPs by then, I knew that 1 oscillator was definitely not enough, 2 was not enough, and 3 would be nice, but wasn't really necessary for this. So it's 2 oscillators. In those days, you could buy an Odyssey, you could buy a 2600, you could buy a Mini Moog. That was 80% 90% of the business. There are a couple other companies, and all of those machines had a 4-pole low pass filter. And a couple of years before, back in the early 70s, the engineer that worked for Alan Perlman and designed the 2600 also did a lot of work on the 2500. And there was a module in the 2500 that was a 2-pole low pass filter using what's called a state variable organization. And it was characterized by the fact that the circuit put out low pass, band pass, and high pass all at the same time. And Dennis Colin, that designed this, gave a paper at the AES convention back in 72, 73 about this module and state variable filter. Now, I thought it'd be great to put that filter in the SEM because we had a 2600 with a 4-pole, we had a Mini Moog with a 4-pole, we had Odyssey with a 4-pole, et cetera, et cetera. And so it would give it more opportunities to make different sounds to the musician using it, because he could always get a 4-pole low pass. They all had that. So that's what I pinned in the SEM because I knew that circuit. I'd read that paper, and I thought the idea was to give something different because nobody's going to use an SEM by itself.
Of course not.
And, I knew Dave Rossum pretty well then, so I had him design the VCO for me because he and his partner were selling some of their EMU synthesizers, and I had talked to him. I knew he was a genius designer, and I couldn't design a VCO. You got to worry about drift and accuracy and on and on and on. It's a very precise circuit, and already knew Dennis Colin because I talked to him about his state variable filter for the 2500. I said, "We designed me one for my module." So he designed the filter. And at that time, I had an engineer working for me named Jim Cooper, and he was very sharp engineer. He later had his own company outside of Synth and did very well. And he designed the envelope generator, probably from Electro Notes. I don't know if you've ever seen Electro Notes. It was a bunch of circuits that were published in the 70s, and an LFO. And then I designed the power supply, and certainly I designed the front panel because
you did.
I tried different things, but I wanted to make it easy to understand.
I think it is like a bit. I also just want to reflect on the fact that it's such a clean and. Would you ask people for their opinions, or were you of the opinion, especially having sold ARPs, you'd be like, I
had sat down with people when I'd sell them a 2600, and you got all this stuff, and they're looking at it like, where do you even start, right? I said, well, it's very simple. Over here, you've got a slider for VCO1, you got a slider for VCO2, and those go into the filter. And the filter then is here, and if you want to change the attack and decay, you've got an envelope generator. I said, just work with that. The 2 oscillators, the filter, the 2 envelope generators. If you want to do some modulation, you got this LFO. That's it. VCO1, VCO2, VCF, VCA, envelope 1, envelope 2, LFO. Don't do anything else. Leave the microphone preamp alone. Leave the CV inverter circuit alone, and just do that. I did that over and over and over again. Over 2 or 3s of selling ARPs, and so it was natural. I also read stuff about. There weren't books on synthesizers there, but there were some articles, and it always emphasizes you need oscillators, filters, VC, envelope generators, LFO. So that was easy, and the layout was easy. So because of teaching teaching people how to play a 2600. It's very simple if you cut out all the other stuff.
But what about these bidirectional knobs? I think that's quite a sweet little idea of, in the center it does nothing, on the left it does frequency, on the right it does pulse width, and I think that's not on the ARP. There's not.
I've seen equipment that had stuff like that. Well, there were mixers that had certainly pots with a mechanical detent in the center were not new. I'd seen them, and I knew how to buy those. And then there was the question of Dave Ross and I talked about this. I found the octave switching of a VCO kind of an inconvenient, and I asked Russ, is there any reason why we can't go 5 octaves or 4 or 5 octaves with one turn of the knob? And he said, no, there's no problem there. The only problem is that it'd be very hard to set the pitch to 2 oscillators 1 hertz apart with the knob, and so I found that the same knob company had this vernier thing. So that was that. So, and other than that, the rest was pretty straightforward. And of course, the center detent thing was just to get more on the small panel. It wasn't really, I didn't have to think about it very long. On every oscilloscope on the planet, there is a knob you turn to synchronize the signal so it stays steady in it, and you can go left and right on that. That wasn't anything I had to, I'd seen it already. So it was just a lot of different bits of experience that I cobbled together. However, when the engineer at work for Jim Cooper and I got the first prototype working, I thought, well, this is great. This is what I want, but the sound isn't really the way I want it. In those days, I had this storefront building ring modulators, phase shifters, and other things. And in the same building, there was this little office on the 3rd floor, and I rented this office for. I think they let me work there for a week or two because I'd been a client in that building now for several years, and I took the prototype, soldering iron, and bag of resistors, and I had a amp and a speaker, and I worked for 3 or 4 days, and no science here. I just tweaked resistors in the signal path until I thought I had what I wanted. I think the essence of it was that Jim, the circuit, the only circuit we had in those days, again, this is before digital, the only circuit we had where we could voltage control an amplifier. And from an amplifier, you can make voltage controlled filters, voltage controlled envelope filters, and VCOs. The signal path in this simple thing is the 2 oscillators go through a very simple mixer. The mix of the 2 VCOs goes into the filter, and the filter goes to the VCA, and that goes to the outside world. It's simple. And so you've got a point where the oscillator signals are so high, they go into the filter, and the filter has some limit. The signals get too high, it distorts, in the same way with the VCA. The thing that made synthesizers possible in the early 1970s was a part called a 3080. And it was sort of like an op amp, but because you could control the gain with a voltage. The only problem is unlike a typical op amp circuit where you use feedback to reduce the distortion in, let's say, an amplifier made out of an op amp, you can reduce you can add feedback and reduce the distortion. It wasn't possible to add feedback on this circuit. So you only had from 0 volts to about 100 millivolts, in other words, 1/10 of a volt, before the circuit completely, this 3080 would completely be clipping.
Yeah.
So between 0 and 100 millivolts was your working range. And if you are worried about distortion, you want to keep the signals low. if you don't care quite as much about a distortion, you can run it hotter and have better noise, signal to noise. You can't.
Yeah, you surely get noise, if the signal is low. Yeah.
So I think what I did is I played with that. I know that when I first hooked it up, I think Jim, my engineer Jim, was concerned about distortion. So we had the signals pretty low. And I think generally over the 3 or 4 days I did this, I increased the signal levels between the oscillators and the filter, and between the filter and the VCA. And I just kept trying resistors, unplugging, or not unplug. I had to desolder one and put another one in. And I did that until I got it to where I liked it.
Were you, and I suppose in essence, were you welcoming a little bit of distortion just to, because I know like with the Moog, the Mini Moog, legendarily, it distorts internally, and that's considered part of the tone.
Yeah, that was in this circuit, in a circuit that uses a 3080, it doesn't, well, eventually you might call it clipping, but it's not like a digital circuit where it's really great until you hit the limit, then it just cuts right off. This was kind of like a little curve, and so it kind of would roll off before it really clipped. And so you'd have to, along this level of 0 to 100 millivolts, you had a choice of where you could put that. And I pushed it toward the distortion. It took several years before people started to appreciate the sound of the SM, because everybody wanted a 4-pole Mini Moog. That's all they wanted. But I think the fact that there is a certain amount of distortion is what I think is the key to the SM sound.
And had you, at the time, so people didn't appreciate it, but you must surely later have had quite positive experiences of seeing people really shredding and savoring what you'd created.
Well, this is the story I love to tell. So when I started selling SCMs or 2-voice, 4-voice with SCMs in them, it was like, let me go back. One of the characteristics of this 2-pole state variable filter that is a classic design in electronics, but Dennis Cullen used it in this module for the 2500, and that's what he used for my SCM filter, is that theoretically it doesn't oscillate no matter how much feedback or resonance you add. Now, there is some feedback in this circuit. It's not the thing that controls the distortion of the circuit. It's what makes what happens when you turn the resonance, or what in the Mini Moog for whatever it's
emphasis.
Called. Emphasis, and you get this sound. And theoretically, that circuit won't oscillate, whereas a Mini Moog, you turn it up and it nicely distorts, but it doesn't get that really high amplification that you get in a 2-pole filter. So in the 70s, people were using the SCM, and they'd say, "Tom, I love it, but if I turn the resonance up too high, it really distorts, so I have to back off." 30 years later, they say, "Tom, I love that SCM because I can turn that resonance. It's really great."
It distorts.
So I think you can assign some of that to the passage of time.
But ultimately, there was you with resistors, and you were gravitating organically to the slightly more distorted end of the spectrum. I think
definitely. I'm absolutely convinced that the sound in an SCM, classic SCM, is where I set those signal levels, and where there's maybe a little more distortion than if I had been set lower to lower the. The curve is very simple. It's like this, like that. So it starts off slow. It's kind of linear here, and then it rounds off. And you got 100 millivolts to play with, or less, actually. And where you set that level, I'm convinced that's why the SM sounds good. That doesn't mean to say that other stuff doesn't sound good. The Mini Moog sounds great, A lot of other stuff sounds great. I'm just talking about my Insacium, and some people really like it.
And so you'd become a synth manufacturer. You were making 2 voices and 4 voices. And do you, I know you've got like a picture on the wall of the 2 voice. Is that because does it hold more significance to you for some reason? Or is it, if you had to pick a favorite?
This is really kind of more of a sidebar to the long story, but the 2 voice is my all-time favorite. I'm not a keyboard player, but I love being able to, on a little box, you can have 2 VCOs, and you can drive one with the sequencer, have both of them have 2, or what, that the idea of you can have the oscillator drive both, the sequencer drive both, or 1-on-1. I love it. It's my baby. But you talk about becoming a synthesizer manufacturer. Well, I almost didn't. So from 1975, when I showed the 4 voice at the NAMM show in Chicago, and by 76, it was starting to do well. In 77, I sold a lot of them, and on a lot of records, especially records that I loved, Birdland, on and on and on.
How does that feel?
Oh, I love that. But so I naturally, to build several products and whatever, I had to get add people to my little company, and everything was going along fine, making a little money and selling the 4 voice and the little 2 voice occasionally. Then at the the winter NAMM show in 1978, the main show was still in Chicago, but there was the beginning of the West Coast show
in Anaheim.
I've
been many times. Not then. I wasn't born then, but
yeah. In the basement of the Disneyland Hotel, they had a mini NAMM, and there was a company there called Sequential Circuits. And
rings a bell.
I mean, it was in a small little booth. I think it was Dave and one other person. I didn't know him at all. I never even heard of him. I'd never even heard of the company. So we went in there, and I had a couple of my guys with me, and it was a very early prototype. I won't tell you what it became, because it became a monster, of course, but we never heard of them. Didn't know anything about it. Had it was set up. I don't even remember the sounds I heard, but other than that, the guys I had with me, we went back to my shop and we said, "Oh, Tom, it's just a polyphonic mini Moog, nothing to worry about." I'm not sure I believed them, but I wasn't too worried, except by 1978. I'm sorry, as 1978 moved along, and Dave got all the manufacturing bugs out. It started taking off, and our 4 voice sales just were falling like a stone.
And are we talking about the Prophet 5 here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And by, I'd say, early fall of 1978, September, October, my engineer Jim and I talked about this and realized that if we didn't do something, we'd be out of business. Not only was it portable, but it stored patches, it had auto-tune. It was everything that a synth needed to have. And so Jim and I started working on, I think in September, October of 78, on what we later called the OBX, and we took it to the 1979 and Summer NAMM, which was in Atlanta. It barely worked because we had to start from scratch. In terms of microprocessor controlled things, we started from absolute scratch. We had to buy a microprocessor development system. We had to solve the problems of voltage controlled envelope generators and whatever.
So, and it's like, behind the scenes, it's a complete or mostly complete analog synth, and you have to put a layer of digital control over everything and have it work flawlessly.
Well, it was the OBX was an SEM with the addition of voltage controlled envelope generators.
Right.
And of course, an voltage controlled LFO was simple. We worked it out. By then, Doug Curtis, I think, was just beginning his career with his chips, and he had envelope generator chip, I believe. That's how it worked. Anyway, by the June summer show, NAMM 1979, we're in Atlanta. Jim and I have put together the OBX in record time. It barely worked. And the show started on Friday. I was not overly confident that it would go well. I thought that this is it. If we don't get orders tomorrow or while we're here, we can't continue. I didn't have, all my income was going away pretty much. So I went to the motel in downtown Atlanta, and I went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. So I got up and I went down to the lobby of the hotel, and I wrote the OBX owner's manual. And went to the next day with trepidation. Show started at 10 a.m. By noon, we'd sold $500,000 of OBX. And that's $500,000 in 1979 dollars. So we knew
you didn't have anything to give them though at that point, though, did you? So you had to build them.
No, that's all much later.
How were you feeling that afternoon?
Well, it was great. I know we could stay, and already, it was like I'd gotten to casually meet Roger Lynn, and he had his very first LM1 out, and I thought, well, actually, what happens? My sales manager and I invited Roger to come to our facility in Santa Monica, and we said, Roger, you've got no company. Why don't you let us build them, and we'll just pay a royalty. You don't have to do anything yourself. He said, no, I want to have my own company. So we hired this guy, and his job was to design what would become the DMX. I gave a lecture in computer music at a university in Long Beach, California, and they had a very nice electronic music lab with a big Moog and a Synclavier. And this I called him a kid at the time. Young kid worked there for $5 an hour, keeping the electronic music studio going and everything calibrated and hooked up. And after I gave my lecture on computer music, he sat down with me and he showed me the Synclavier front and back. And I said, not only is it an interesting machine, but this guy, he's so young and he knows this machine backwards and forwards. And we'd been thinking about, in addition to doing the DMX, doing a polyphonic sequencer. So I hired the Ken on the spot, or a couple of weeks later. It was the first job that he'd ever had. He had dropped out of high school because he was an excellent keyboard player, and so he was making money at age 18 and 19 playing gigs in the studios and record stuff, but never had a real-time job. His name was Marcus Ryle, who later went on and did Line 6, but he was just a kid when I hired him. But with his help and other engineers from the OBX on to DMX, DSX, OBXA, OB8, and then to our by then Marcus was really like chief engineer. He and his the guy he started Line 6 with, Marcus, and Michelle was his name. They worked for me about 5 years and started this consulting company that led to Line 6.
With something like the DMX, I think there's very important at the time, and obviously, and then its sonic stamp is over so many of the records at that time. Like I believe Blue Monday is is that, that is an amazing record. But my question is like, how do you arrive at the sounds that were in it? I know later you had a like Promo device that could, reprogram the sounds, but it's a simple question of just like, how did you decide on what was the right sounding kick, the right sounding snare, the hi-hat? Who decided that? How were they done?
Not being a musician, I didn't do anything. It was the group of us would judge the sound. I started with the recordings, of course, and
did you record? Did you find an ideal kit, or like, and where are those? Are those?
I had nothing to do with that. I had maybe a staff of 6 engineers, and the company had grown to 80 people, and I was always worried about the future and making payroll and stuff, and so I got people, and I hired a guy who was real good at getting as much on the technology we used for the playback on the DMX circuits, and then I think between different people we knew, we hired people to do the sounds. I don't remember anything about that. We kind of had the market to ourselves because between between the DMX and the first Lindrum, Roger could sell everything he made, and we could sell everything we made. So it was the only game in town till, I guess, the TR-808 came a year or two later. We were able to cobble it all together, the three of them together, with some kind of funky circuitry that they all synchronized together, and we sold a few, as we call the system.
You mentioned the word synchronization. Obviously, we're about to get to like 1983, which was obviously it was the year I was born, which is the second most important thing that happened in 1983. But, can you talk about MIDI? Presumably, you were involved with the. How did it come about?
The history books say I was involved with MIDI. In reality, I had basically nothing to do with MIDI.
Right.
At the time that Dave Smith gave his AES paper on his ideas that became MIDI, he gave a technical paper on it. I noted it, but I had, like I said, 80 people to keep paid, and I really transitioned from becoming a designer of pedals and designer to some extent of synthesizers, and I turned into an entrepreneur, and I was always chasing my tail to keep the company in business. So I got less and less, and I kind of let the people. I think the secret to my first company success was I hired good people, and I let them go. We made some good decisions. The OBX was a modest seller next to the Prophet 5, which was a huge seller. We weren't that competitive. But as we passed through the years from 79 to, let's say, 83, 84, we brought out newer machine. The OBX became the OBX-A with the addition of all Curtis chips, and the OBX-A became the OB8, where we had better software. Whereas my impression was that the Prophet 5 didn't change that much. It was pretty much for several years what they showed when they first showed it at NAMM. And also the sound, the so-called Oberheim sound, started to be appreciated for its own particular sound. And as synthesizer used in music became a bigger and bigger thing, we had our people, and Dave had his people, and Roland had their people, and Korg had their people, etc. And different machines did different things, and the market really expanded. In 1982, an engineer at another company said, Tom, Yamaha's working on something, and when it comes out, this is like at a NAMM show, and we're all drinking a little bit and stuff. And he says that Yamaha is coming out with a product that in a year, you'll be out of business. And I said, oh, that's interesting. After the DX7 came out, for the next 3 years, my company grew 50% every year.
Grew.
And my analysis always has been that the DX7 opened a market. So where you'd rarely see a guy in a bar playing an Oberheim or Prophet, there'd be a DX7. It made it a legitimate item and became much more popular. Of course, a lot of people bought DX7 because they had a good road sound. So they didn't have to lug around a 100-pound roads, and they had a pretty good B3 sound. They didn't have to lug around a 300-pound or 200-pound B3, and it did very well. But it helped our business.
They say the rising tide raises all ships.
Oh, yeah.
So that's interesting to hear you say that. Did it influence things like the Xpander, which they, and you see Roland making things like the JX8P, which look digital, but are analog, because that's the technology they knew?
No. When we brought out the DMX and DSX, it was the first music products that I'd ever seen that had alphanumeric displays. They were very simple very expensive, very simple Hewlett-Packard calculator displays, but they did display letters and numbers. And I felt very strongly about that. And I wanted to continue that, but not using those because they didn't have enough. They were too small and too expensive. So as Marcus and his later partner started working on the Xpander, I wanted to move the user interface, mechanical part of the user interface to another level. And so the first thing is I found this display that was brand new. It was uses the technology of fluorescent tubes to be brighter and bigger, and it was my decision to use those. And the other thing I'd seen about that time, I'd never seen before, and I saw it on a German drum machine called the Room Simulator or something like that, and it had shaft encoders. I'd never seen those before. And I thought, well, that's exactly what we need, because it's such a pain in the ass on an OB8. You want to set something, but you want to increase it, but it's already too far, and you got to turn it all the way off and then go back. And here, there was no stop and start. It was just continuous. My contribution was to bring in these displays and encoders. But as far as the features of the voice, that was largely due to the guy that became Marcus's partner when they did Line 6, Michel Doidic. He was able to, for instance, in the filter was not 2-pole or 4-pole. It was like 12 pole, or no, not, but 12 different things. So, and there was extra. So it was just the same thing with more power from microprocessors and more things to help the user interface. And so I feel good because I had my hand in it to on one level, but it was really done by Marcus and Michel. Those were the Matrix 12 and the Xpander were their machines.
But had you been talking about making something like that and then you saw the screen, or did you see the screen and think, I should make something like that?
Well, we got to go into other parts of my history. By 1985, we were still selling OB8s, we were selling DMXs, DSXs, we were selling Xpanders, we were selling Matrix 12s. Without going into long, unpleasant details, in May of 1985, my trusted lawyer of 15 years ended up with the business. And I won't get into that now, only because it's kind of boring. But at the time that happened, I thought that what he was doing was going to save the company, and turned out the company wasn't really in danger. because talking to the wrong people. And at that point, Oberheim innovation kind of stopped, as did for a short period of time Sequential and Roger Lynn and stuff. And both Roger and Dave's first company went away in 1986. And we're flooded with workstations from Japan that everybody wanted because they did everything. They weren't typically classic analog machines. They had the sound, but more importantly, they had a lot of it was you could do a whole movie with a D50 or an M1, and analog was pretty much dead in the late 1980s and the 1990s, except for this phenomenon where people started going to parties and playing records, and then they started getting artistic playing these records, and then they started giving concerts playing these records, and the whole dance music thing just exploded. And I've been told that these people weren't that enamored with digital sound.
I would already say they love both, but they definitely didn't want to get rid of the analog stuff, and the analog stuff was cheap. And that's the thing, and it was available, and because it was cheap,
you're right. One didn't replace the other, but analog came back.
Yeah.
While things were doing well, when we first saw a TR-808, and we said, well, it's an interesting machine. It has some kind of a 7 transistor thing to make cymbals. And I actually met the engineer that did that, and it was pretty simple and didn't have the best sound compared to what you had in a Lindrum or a DMX, but that's what they could buy in a pawn shop for $50.
Mm-hmm.
That made that help.
I have to beg to differ on the sound, but that's the thing is it didn't sound real, did it? It sounded electronic and strange, but it was.
I said in comparison to.
Yeah.
Because I don't think that the DMX or the Lindrum or Elm or whatever created dance music drums. They used them, but they used other. And of course, there's a lot of drums out there.
Yeah.
But the important thing in this, as far as synthesizers are concerned, is they started coming back around 2000. Dave got back in the business in 2002 and had his Evolver stuff, and then he got out the Prophet 08 in 2008, and his business just exploded. Oh, and of course, my lawyer ended up with my company in 1985, and he drained about $2.5 million out of it, and then sold what was left to Gibson, and they fiddled with it for a little bit. But by the turn of the century, I was working in Silicon Valley, completely out of music. Didn't really have any thought of being back in the music business. I thought it was all over pretty much. I followed Dave. What Dave was doing is we got into the first 10 years of 2000 and saw he was doing well, but I was absolutely not in a position to get back in the business because I didn't have the money, but more importantly, I didn't own the name or the logo. The logo and the name had passed on to other people, so I couldn't do anything, really. But while this was happening, we were starting to see the prices of used OBA, OBXAs, OBXs start to climb and climb and climb in the used market. $3,000 machine became $6,000, $9,000, $12,000. And I wasn't the only person that noticed that, but there was still nothing I could do, really. I couldn't resurrect Oberheim because I didn't own it. The name was owned by somebody else. For a while, it was Gibson. They did a few products that had Oberheim, but then they kind of let it drift off. And Uli stepped in and kind of picked it up here and there. And so I was done. But then in the starting, I guess, this is 2024, I guess, around 2021 or somewhere in there, Dave's company got bought by Focusrite. I was interested in seeing that happen, but it still didn't mean a whole lot to me. And then Marcus Rowell came to me and said, well, maybe we could do something. And he and his wife, Sue, worked for a while, and through an absolutely amazing series of hard work by Marcus, he got my name back from Uli. And then the name was bought by Focusrite. So then we're up to today. Me and my wife and daughter are very happy that happened.
Yeah.
I'm going back to your first question. I did think about doing some stuff in the 2020s, but it's I'm 88 I'm now 88. Back then I was 86, and I thought, this is. I'm too old for this. So in 1986, I didn't do anything specific, but after 62 years as a professional engineer, which started in 1959 when I transitioned from being a lowly draftsman to being an engineer, 62 years, I decided that was enough, and I called myself retired. And so I no longer design stuff. I'm closely allied with Sequential. The Sequential company is Sequential's company is, of course, is a division of Focusrite, and so the things that happen in Oberheim are through Sequential. I'm a consultant to the company, and that's where we are today.
When you think about the products that they will develop, and Oberheim products, we obviously see that you've got the OB6 and the TEO5. We've got these things that are sort of new Oberheim products, basically. I suppose my question to you is kind of, what in your eyes makes something validly an Oberheim product? How do you sum up what an Oberheim synth should be?
Well, even with the addition of modern control technology that Dave Smith developed when he started, it left over from his first company, and then he developed a lot of very interesting control circuitry for developing lots of CVs and et cetera, a lot of marvelous software, because Dave was a fantastic software engineer, where I hate software. I don't know. That's another story.
Okay.
Personally, I couldn't really do things in today's world because the technology's changed to where I'm not really that much of an expert. I continue to have ideas. I have discussions with Sequential. The TO5, I think, was I have one. It's I don't know if you can see it here, but there it is. It's a prototype, but you can see it here. There. That's a TO5. I think it's fantastic.
I suppose my question is kind of what do you love about it, and what is, if these things are going to bear your name, then what is it that they must be?
As far as our industry is concerned and what we're talking about, my education from starting in 1970 and up to today was one of learning how to trust musicians' ears, which I didn't have because I wasn't a trained musician. As an engineer, I did a lot of choir singing in college, but that's the only music stuff I ever did. And my first lesson along this line was back in the days when I was an art dealer selling 2600s and Odysseys. Odyssey had just come out, and I had gotten to know Jan Hammer because he had used one of my ring modulators in the Mahavishnu band he was in. We were talking one day, this is 72, 73, something like that. And he said, Tom, I'm going to get a synthesizer. Oh, I said, great, Jan. There's this Odyssey is really great. And it's got all these features. It's got more features than a Mini Moog. Oh, okay. No, Tom. No. It doesn't have the sound. It doesn't have that. What do you mean the sound? Well, the sound, I want that Mini Moog sound. That was lesson number one. I learned a little bit from that. Another thing that happened was we fast forward up to the days of the 4-voice, 8-voice, 1976. By then, I had met Joe Zawinul. So he was playing with Cannonball Adderley, and we met each other talking on the phone about ring modulator. I stayed, I went to hear the band a few times, and I knew the people in the band because Jocko also had an 8-voice. Joe had an 8 voices. So there was a point in time, 76, 77, he was living in Pasadena and had a nice house there. And he called me and said, Tom, I got one of your synths. I got an 8 voice, and I wonder if you'd mind coming over and showing me something about it. I said, sure. So I went over to his place. It's about 45 minutes from my apartment in Santa Monica. And I did the natural engineer thing. And so, Joe, there's VCOs, and that stands for voltage controlled oscillator. And those go into the VCF, which is called voltage controlled filter. You got this thing called an envelope generator. It gives you rise times and fall times. And he's very nice, saying, oh, yeah. So after an hour or two of that, I left, and I figured he's going to take it back. He's going to take it back to wherever he bought it, get his money back, because, I could see I wasn't getting through to him. So 4 or 6 weeks pass, and he calls me on the phone, and he says, Tom, you got to hear the sound I got on your machine. And I said, oh, well, I'll come out and see it. And I'm thinking, wait a minute. How can he do it? He doesn't understand what these things do. So I got to his house, and he played me a rough mix of Birdland. And it's like, oh, my God. And he made me a cassette tape of this rough mix of Birdland. God, I wish I'd saved that cassette.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
Anyway, so those are two stories. But it's this nebulous thing called sound. I mean, not textbook sound, but our sound, the sound of what you hear and I hear and all our good friends and all the millions of people that are serious about making music electronically. It's the sound. And when I played around with the SCM, I was lucky, or I was really not had something to do with it. I don't know, but it doesn't matter. It's happened. It's with us, and I love when I hear a good synthesizer record, and there's a lot of them out there. And I couldn't begin to guess where electronic keyboards will go in the next 20 years. But what I see is a continual birth of instruments that are in a lot of ways aren't that different, and yet they get a following, like the UDO thing. I've never met what's his name, George.
He's really nice,
but he seems to be doing a great job. So they exist, and I'm happy about that. I wouldn't even begin to guess where it goes. The price comes down. I remember this. I think there was something around for $99 here a couple of years ago, or maybe it was $150. It was really an honest, good God synthesizer. I think it was maybe the guys in Italy.
I know what you mean.
And So I couldn't begin to guess where it'll go, but it's been a marvelous life for me. Just I've had such a good time.
Well, amen to that. Thank you, Tom Oberheim, for your work and your time.
Yeah.
You really never know what can happen when someone asks you to build a ring modulator, can you? I love that as Tom was wrapping up, I didn't even need to ask the final question that I always ask at the end of Why We Bleeps, what is the future of music technology? As Tom simply read my mind and was able to just go on and answer it automatically. And whatever the future may hold for Oberheim and any other brand, it is really interesting to ask him, what makes it successful? What is the difference in the house style of Oberheim? And according to Tom, it's sound. It's the sound that you respond to, which is obvious, obviously, on one level. Of course, all that matters is how it sounds, because that's all that people hear. But if someone was to observe music technology discourse on the internet, you will see how people pore over features, the sample time, the amount of oscillators, the amount of presets and everything like that. Because it's easy to forget that the value of a musical instrument, I think, has very little to do with how many features it has, but instead whether it inspires some kind of emotional reaction in you. And time spent holed up in a spare office to dial in the ranges of the sound of the SEM by tweaking resistors to fine-tune the tone so it sounds good. Those are really subtle things that are not visible from the front panel, but your body knows it when you use that thing. And I think interface is a huge factor, obviously, in whether or not you spend time to discover a new sound. So interface matters just as much as sound, because it's the means by which you find it. But above all, you're going to be fulfilled or not by the feedback loop between the interface and what you hear back. And if the sound does not make you feel things, what's the point? And after we finished this conversation, I hit stop, and the podcasting software that I use needs a minute to upload the files from the guest to me. And so as we were just sat there, Tom started to ask me about my background and how I got into all of this. And as I was sort of explaining my love of electronic music, and Tom went on to give an example of a friend of his. They'd gone to see a Steve Reich concert. And to start with, Tom said at first he just was bored, but he stuck with it. And he said after about half an hour, he was like, I didn't want to leave. I was completely engrossed and wanted to listen to it over and over again. And I think that's an interesting example when you think about what makes a good sound. He's reminding me to keep an open mind, because something truly new, I think, is unlikely to sound good to you on first listen. I think it's going to sound like noise when a brain has no framework to kind of understand the sound or the music. So the important thing is to listen with an open mind to what good sound might actually be. Like Tom developing the SEM, where an engineer might be tempted to ensure that a sine wave passes through undisturbed, and it's actually the distortion of it being wrong that would make the thing sound good. Well, only with an open mind might you say, actually, it was better with the mistakes. Tom is living proof that you don't quite know where you're going to end up if you pursue your interests, if you ask questions, and if you surround yourself with great people, as Tom is quick to say that he did. His designs were collaborations, many of them, as he says on his site, tomoberheim.com, I didn't design all of this, I had help. Yeah, and now I want a two voice, so thanks for that, Tom. I love talking to Tom. I found him incredibly warm and patient and keen to discuss and share his life experience. So thank you, Tom, for taking the time to speak to me. That is a treasure. So thank you. I will remember this, as you can well imagine. And thank you, Mrs. Oberheim, for allowing me to steal Tom. Here's your spiritual permission to buy everything that you've ever wanted that has the word Oberheim written on it. Go hog wild. Absolutely crazy. Buy it all. You can get the TE05, the OBX 8, the OB6 from Sequential. Maybe get a desktop and a full keyboard. Why not? Get it all. And once you're done, please consider going on Patreon, patreon.com/Milo Melodies, if you'd like to support the podcast in its production as we move into the 51st episode. Thank you to sponsors Thong and Signal Sounds, and thank you to Matt Milligan, who edited today's conversation. That's all. See you next time.